everybody. Thank you. My name is Ann Cooper Albright, and I'm really happy to start this first of three Zoom roundtables on the book Resistance and Support. And I will give you the sense of the format. I'll introduce the project briefly. And then I'm going to ask each contributor to introduce themselves and their essay. And then we'll have a conversation among the speakers that you see on your screen. And then after that, we will open it up to questions from the Zoom audience. And just to make sure everybody understands, we are recording, and we're hoping to be able to put these three round tables up on assorted links, different places, so that they'll be available. And I guess I want to both thank Annika, my student assistant, who is arranging all of this, and also Michelle, who suggested it. She was like, well, we should do something. I was like, okay, I guess we'll do it. But here we are. And I do think that it's the books out there. And I think of this as like kind of pushing it to the next stage in some way. I will just right now introduce the project. So in the summer of 2020, when we were all locked down, I was spending a lot of time in Warner, Maine by myself, calling on the ghosts of Warner, Maine. And of course, we were all mourning the untimely death of Nancy Stark Smith. And we had done the 25th anniversary of Contact at Oberlin. And I decided that we were going to, against all the forces coming at us, that I was going to start trying to get some grants together to do the 50th anniversary of Contact. When we got to the place where I really believed it was going to happen, I started calling it critical mass. And the reason is that I felt as if we had at Contact Improvisation had kind of created a critical mass. I also felt as if I wanted to underline the history and recognize at 50 years we could become critical of what we were doing, that we could engage critically with the form, and not fear that in doing that we would destroy it, but actually push to make it more like live up to its kind of utopian vision a little bit more, or live up to, its foot in social justice. And so that's why I got started with that. As part of it, we did a year-long series of events, including a jam in the fall to which 70 people came. Now, we were all masked, and this was just starting for a lot of people the first time of doing Contact after the pandemic shutdown. And then in January, I invited Yuri Konjar, who had worked intensively with Steve Paxton, to come do a winter term 50 years after Steve had done his 1972 winter term. And with that came, along with Sarah Young, 12 international dancers from all over the world. We had people from Argentina and Poland and Slovenia, the United States and India, and they stayed for 7 months and were working with myself and the students and helped to organize things. And then after I had an exhibition called Collective Gestures in the Art Museum. We had a memorial exhibition on Nancy Stark Smith, specifically the underscore and Contact Quarterly in the library. And then we did this big event with over 300 international dancers called Critical Mass, CI at 50, from July 7th to the 11th. I was able to get a little bit of funding to invite people who had proposed essays to stay for 3 days afterwards and to do the writing workshop. And so many of the essays in this collection are developed out of that writing workshop with a lot of back and forth among the essayists and among myself and the people who are writing contributions. In addition, there are some other people brought from the panels or different things, brought in some essays. The collection is divided into three sections: productive tensions, responsive touch, and local communities, global contexts. And so each of these Saturdays, we're looking at one section. Today, we have panelists who are contributors to the productive tensions section. And I'm just going to read the first paragraph or two of the introduction, because I think it's probably the best way to do it. For a long time, contact improvisers prided themselves on going with the flow. One of the unspoken measures of a dancer's skill was the ability to blend their energies with another person's movement. At the end of the 20th century, most contactors learned to release into the support of gravity and follow the point of contact as it rolled across our bodies and through the space. Aikido rolls helped us fall with grace, and the ease with which dancers were lifted onto a shoulder was an enviable quality of the most virtuosic dancing. The shadow side of this smooth, effortless flow, however, could be a manipulative pressure to conform with the status quo. Unstated assumptions about one's psychic and physical pliability had different resonances with different bodies. Resistance, tension, anger, and effort were often disparaged. Feminist killjoys were accused of not embracing their full sensuous sexual selves. Women who refused to be lifted were less fun to dance with. And although it's true that one of the early hallmarks of CI was the startling fact that women could lift men, and there was no leader or follower role assigned on the basis of gender, that theoretical openness could easily get lost in the midst of a crowded jam where it was not unusual to see large men lifting smaller women on their shoulders as if they were prized game. Similarly, the social dynamics of being available to all kinds of physical contact can feel downright invasive for some people. BIPOC folks were an anomaly in the largely white postmodern dance context in which CI was cultivated. The sense of ease and flow in one's dancing is built on largely unacknowledged gendered and racial privilege. Not all bodies feel equally safe in jam situations. Entitled Productive Tensions, this section takes up critical discussions across the themes of feminist and queer interventions, racial reckonings, and contested histories. The past decade has brought issues of racial violence, embodied class privilege, and sexual harassment to people's attention, piercing the veneer of that democratic and egalitarian ethos of CI. This reckoning with unspoken power dynamics has had a profound impact on the return to dancing post-pandemic, and many of the essays in this section elaborate the implications of these issues within CI communities. The essays included here all embrace that critical edge, sharing a belief that resistance is valuable and tensions can be productive. So without further ado, maybe Robin, we'll ask you to go first since you're with us right now.
Sure. Um, so I'll give a synopsis of my chapter. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah.
Okay. So my chapter traces this concept of the natural body through two sources, somatics and modern dance, through into contact, and then out of contact into, well, still into contact, but also into the 21st century. And I did that to trace some of the influences in contact improv. And I wanted to trace the natural body because the natural body is a concept which has been adopted, adapted, changed, and so forth through the century. It remains a strong concept for many, and because the natural body comes from early 19th century ideas of evolution and social evolution, racist, heteropatriarchal, and classist ideas can sneak in to practices and we might not even be able to notice it. So my intention with the chapter was to trace ideas of the natural body through modern dance and somatics into contact and show how contact both used them but also changed them and morphed them. And then again, what happened afterwards and into the 21st century and how ideas of the natural body, and I'll add here the neutral body because it does transform into what I call the neutral body, and how they still affect practices, ways in which they're also being questioned and changed, so that we can unroot some of these racist and heteropatriarchal and classist ideas from theories that we would not agree with now.
Robin, do you want to also introduce yourself? I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I'm so sorry. I skipped that whole part. Hi, I'm Robin Raven Pritchard. I am currently in Northeast Ohio, zooming from Northeast Ohio, and I'll give a shout out to the 12 Indigenous owners, stewards of this land.
Cool. Let's see. Dina, would you like to go next?
I I will do it. And I will introduce myself first. I'm an American who moved to Montreal in 1977, where my story begins in this chapter. I taught contact improvisation at a university for 23 years, also community classes. And I also founded a dance presenting space. So I'm a dance curator. And currently in my elder phase, my last quarter of a century, I founded a new journal called Turba, the global journal for practices in live arts curation. Is what I'm doing now. So welcome to any potential authors for my journal. My brief story and backstory, I think of myself as a second generation, but maybe I'm a third generation contact improviser. And I think of this as a slow writing project proposed by Anne over 2 years, really, never taken so much time to write. And Anne kind of framed it by asking me not to diminish the impact of what we felt, this revolution we felt then, but looking at it through a feminist lens, and I'll come to reckoning it in another part of the chapter. So I think I'll follow Anne by reading my first three sentences, because they really represent the first part of the book. So, drawn passionately into the vortex of this revolutionary youth movement 50 years ago, along with so many of my North American and global North peers, I recall how we danced together fervently, but also purposefully. And this is in the United States, by the way. We were dancing in clubs, gymnasiums, theaters and galleries, in the streets, parks, our homes, and at outdoor rock concerts. Our way of moving freely, alone and together, was imbued with a constellation of meanings, heralding a new era of liberties, embarking on social experiments, and not the least, promoting world peace. So that's the opening of my chapter after I quote Cynthia Novak's fantastic chapter on how contact felt like a revolution. So this is the first time I'm writing my own historiography, so I had to dive into my archives and photos and notebooks for the first time. And it's structured in layers through times from my first classes in Minnesota with Mary Cerny at the very beginning. That's 1973. Immigrating to Quebec in 77, launching the first classes and jams and work group. And then I founded an all-women's dance collective called Cat Poteau, based on contact improvisation in 1977. And then we taught workshops. We did what many other contactors did at the time. We began presenting, touring, nomad, moving groups, and we brought Steve, we brought Nancy, Mangrove, almost everyone passed through Montreal during those first years. Then I did some duet work with a really great contact partner, Danielle Godbout, which was all about role reversal, a woman who lifts and carries men, carrying out the feminist thrust of my excitement about contact. So I also taught contact improvisation at a university, forging a kind of a pedagogical university plan, which was a very interesting task. That was from 1985 to 2010. And then later in the essay, I begin, I call it a kind of a reckoning, a kind of revisionary thinking about what's happening now. And vital to that part of my chapter was, of course, participating in the 50th anniversary event at Oberlin, where I felt for the first time um, where the communities of contact had come to, as Anne said, question, think, critique, and really look at the practice in a way that jived more with the world we live in today. That was a very important moment, and the writers' workshop where I was challenged to rethink and to reconsider, what I had thought about contact in the early days. And by the way, I was at the 25th anniversary as well, so the perspective was quite wonderful. So what I wrote about were the new ethical standards, increasing efforts at inclusivity and safe spaces that other people wrote about quite more fulsomely. Then I began seeking online, and I found a lot of research projects, publications, resource websites, and I wrote about all of this in my chapter, and also began to engage in this idea of how contact communities were developing in new cultural contexts, very specific ones around the world, because my own research was in anthropology. But I did come to a very final page, which took the longest and was the most important of all, with which I'll end my presentation. So I asked myself now at 75 years old, and thank you, Anne, for asking me to do this before I had no more memory to offer. It was the perfect point. The question was, what does all of this engagement in contact improvisation since my youthful fervence, what does it all mean to me now, in my life now? And I invite you to read those last few paragraphs because they're still very, very, very touching, I think. It's a vital question. What does it mean now for me? Thank you, Anne. Thank you,
You're
Anne, for
welcome.
inviting me.
Yeah. And I think we can maybe take up that question a little bit later as a group. So, Michelle, can I ask you to introduce yourself and then present next, please?
Hi, I'm Michelle Beaulieu. I did contact for many years and then stopped and then came back. And there was an incident that sent me on this journey of looking for a safer, brave space. I grew up in Milwaukee as my hometown. I went to college in Chicago and stayed there for 45 years and just moved back in June to my hometown. So anyway, so my essay is getting there from here, a roadmap for safer, brave, open jams. And as I said, there was an incident that sent me on this journey of looking of how we might create safer jams. And I went to the jam leaders and tried to talk about policies and procedures, what we might be able to do. And it just became clear that I wasn't getting anywhere. And the problem was, what were the fundamental values that we were promoting? And in my view, it needed to be community care, responsibility, empathy, listening, respect for each other as a community. But in contact, there has been a thread of people who promote something called the first rule of contact improv, which is take care of yourself. And I think that it comes out, it's not necessarily always said that blatantly or explicitly, but it can be subtle in terms of starting with educating people about their boundaries and maintaining boundaries and learning how to say no. And if that's where it starts, that's not a good thing. I'm not saying that it's not a good rule. I'm saying it's a good second rule, not the place to start. So if we start with ethos of community care, how do we build a jam or group based on that? So I developed guidelines for that. So you start with your stated values, stating your values clearly, and then develop uh, how can you live into those values. So community practices like opening and closing circles, like democratic governance, where people have input and there's clarity. Um, and then what do you do when those values aren't upheld? What kind of accountability, commitments, and community response do you do? So you've got a vision, a way to build it, and then the challenge often is how do you get there? Because not necessarily everybody is on board. There's history of harm, and I think a big thing is outside agitation that puts pressure on a group to really make this a priority and move forward on it. So I just want to note that today there are protests all around the U.S. And that's a form of, agitation. And basically, I think the U.S. is a first world country in a first rural mentality of personal responsibility first. And I'd like to think that this work in how to create a safer, brave space, which I think is applicable beyond contact improv jams, is providing a vision that another world is possible.
Great. I think we can return to that too. um, but first, Sarah, let's hear from you, please.
Yes, on that note of another world being possible, my name is Sarah Young. I'm based in Northampton, Massachusetts. I had been a director at Earth Dance Creative Living in Plainfield, Massachusetts, and I'm a current graduate student at Smith College. I teach at Spiral and Root training program at Earth Dance in January, and I teach Finding the Sparkle at Ponderosa outside of Berlin in Germany each June. So my essay is underscoring Nancy Stark Smith's legacy, definitions, and disruptions. It focuses on the underscore, a framework for improvising dance as a group at its most basic level. It was originated by Nancy Stark Smith starting in the early 1990s. She was sourcing the phenomena that she observed was already happening while teaching contact improvisation. And she organized it into a sort of a navigation system with phases, aspects, and connections, and these corresponding glyphs, these drawings. And so in the past 35 years, the underscore has evolved and developed to be practiced in many different situations across the globe. In fact, the global underscore is happening June 21st. It'll celebrate its 25th anniversary this year with over 75 sites internationally participating. So my essay follows 3 of my own personal experiences with the underscore. It includes an underscore that I had danced with Nancy as part of a weekly practice with a small group in Northampton. Another story is one of an underscore that I facilitated with a group of students and guest artists at Oberlin, and had invited me as part of this exhibition she described with Nancy and celebrating the 50th anniversary. And then I came back that following July in 2022 to Oberlin for critical mass, and I co-facilitated a giant underscore, with a group that I write about in my essay. Yeah, so I practiced the underscore with Nancy for nearly 10 years, and I learned so many things from her, both in the practice and beyond. And as I was reflecting on this morning, I realized that a primary practice that I really learned from her was how to question what we're doing. Like, what happened? How? In what proportions? What were the influences? What if we dialed this up and that down? And the focus was on our improvising together. And this certainly telescoped out to much bigger questions about CI and life and beyond. And so I think this way of questioning has continued to be a driver for me since she died in 2020. And and so my essay is reflecting on questions of her legacy or legacy in improvisation more broadly, and how sometimes seemingly paradoxically we can hold on to ways of we've always done it that way, or this is how Nancy would have done it, while approaching whatever we're doing as if we've never done it before.
Thank you very much. I think that what I'd like to do is just also mention the other essays. Not everybody could be here with us, but there's an essay by Kristen Horrigan called Gender, Power, and Equity in Contact Improvisation. Joy Mariama Smith wrote Not Contact Improvisation. Emma Biget and Paul Seng wrote Doing It Wrong, Contacts Countercultures. And so those are part of this. Now, it's interesting you were talking about the hands off. So at 2:00 in Oberlin is our big Lorain County hands off protest. And I was thinking about when I named this resistance and support, one of the things I talk about is that it's something I think I found through the physical work of contact, which is that resistance is support. That oftentimes giving resistance is a way to support your partner and allow them to kind of give you more weight. And I was, CI 50 happened now 3 years ago. And I was thinking about new meanings of resistance and support. And I was also thinking about our situation now, at least in America, or in the US, and the ways in which we could both resist and support. When I was walking my dog this morning, I thought, well, the good thing is that contact situations usually don't have any federal funding anyway, so we didn't really have to worry about losing our federal funding the way, the humanities and the libraries, and made me think of you, Sarah. And well, if the library has no funding, will Nancy Stark Smith's archives stay in the basement of Lincoln Center for the next 25 years? But also just thinking about how we can support using contact to support our communities, as well as using contact as a way to resist the kind of forces that are undoing so much of what we assumed should be happening in the world. That things would be getting better instead of worse. So I maybe ask the panelists to turn on your mics. And I guess, the question maybe is, what about now? Where do you feel contact is now, and the ways in which contact can help us deal with the world that is, at least from my perspective, challenging us and kind of falling apart, frankly.
That's sort of a big question, but I just want to say a couple other things about some of the essays who isn't here, and maybe that'll give the rest of us time to think of how to answer that question. I just really want to say that I am really touched and humbled by the other essays in this section that I've been rereading in preparation for today. And I want to mention the ones that didn't get a chance, and some things I got from them. Joy's essay on not contact improv what is poetic and lyrical reflection of dance, of contact and not contact. But it's also, for me, just fascinating that I think that she and I are both trying to create the same thing. I mean, I'm calling it safer, brave space. She's calling it not contact improv. I'm coming at it from a very organizational uh, perspective and how you set up a community like that. And she's coming at it from a much more, I don't want to put words, but cultural perspective on it. And I just feel like, Anne, you put us together, everyone in the essay, and I just was appreciating in this section, appreciating the interconnectedness of what we said. And then in terms of, Dina has a quote about how all dance is ethnic, which was quoting a muse of hers. And I felt like that is really important for contact improv people to recognize. And Emma and Paul's essay had a definition of contact from that kind of perspective. It grew out of elite college environments, mostly, kind of the way you would write about an ethnic dance. And I really appreciated just naming that in a way that and I'm not an expert, but hadn't quite hung on to like that before. So I thought that was a really valuable insight. And then for Kristen's section on objectification and sexual predation, for me, since that is what inspired my focus on safer, brave space, was just a really useful, nuanced conversation about that issue that I hadn't really quite seen before. And she also mentions in that, I mean, there's all these synergies. She was great at pulling in everybody else's essays in the book, which I appreciated. Robin talks about how the blank body is never really blank, and that if you're not, and when you say it's like being colorblind, or being gender blind, that means that if there's something that is indeed gender based or racially based, that it's hard to bring it up because people say it doesn't exist. And I thought that that for me, a lot of the productive tension in this section was about this, how do we do this very, in some ways, physics-based dance while recognizing our humanity.
I'll just put a little historic perspective on this, Dina. I don't know if you remember, but at CI 25, we had a panel on sexual harassment, and there was a lot of pushback about, that's not something we need to worry about because people are, adults and choosing things. And, there was just this like, I remember people saying, but I want to work with my own, sense of sexuality. That was where that feminist killjoy comment came, because I felt as if when I was on that panel and when I brought up, these issues that I thought were pretty important, and maybe we needed as a group to have a kind of ethics, a code of ethics for teaching, because it felt like there were these kind of repetitive patterns of older male teachers, sidling up to younger, excited, beginning students, et cetera, et cetera. That was totally shut down and kind of in a snarky way. So I think we have come very far from that. I also remember, to your point, Michelle, that, and a lot of the points in this section, being at a conference on gender in dance and having two people who are very well respected, contactors say there is no such thing as gender in dance. That gender was something that didn't matter in contact. Well, not in dance, but in contact, because women could lift men, men could lift women. And I remember being like, wow, you guys have no idea. It was just like a whole frame that felt very, um, yeah. And I think I felt, I mean, yeah, I think I would say that I felt like I was pushing against a current for a very long time in this field. So it's exciting to have people take up conversations that I felt people did not want to have for a long time. So that's fun. Um, other thoughts? Yes.
Just a little addendum to that, the 25th anniversary and that incredible panel that I organized. I remember the beginning impetus for it was the fact that it was being taught, as Michelle said, in a lot of universities, beginning to be taught. And I mean, in a university, as a teacher, you cannot touch a student. I mean, that's like a core ethic. And there we were teaching a form based entirely on mutual touching. And I do have a verbatim of that panel that hasn't been published yet that I'd love to get out somewhere. It was everything you said it was. Contentious, the beginnings of the discussion of sexuality and contact. Really a remarkable moment at the 25th, really.
Mm.
And I just want to say, I want to thank everyone who's been pushing against these ideas and these structures for years. Michelle, when I read your article, I was just so surprised at how much pushback you got. And I think there are some others in here and other people who have been pushing for safer jams and just, I mean, the amount of vitriol that gets thrown at people. Um, so I want to say thank you because I I think I have been in these milieus as well, but not necessarily doing the pushing. And I really appreciate all the work that you guys have done to make these better spaces. I'll just have to say, I think that the idea of consent is something that is constantly, my world is revolving around these days because what I have just started noticing is the lack of consent, how much lack of consent there is in this world and how notice substitutes for consent. And I think that that's a little bit how contact improv has been organized. You've been given notice because you're in the room. So that is your consent. It's assumed. And then you have to get yourself out of it if you're taking away that consent. And because I work in higher education, I notice just how much the university is designed around lack of consent. It's notification instead, right? Our syllabi are notifications. It's not really consent. It's not a contract, but we say it is, or some people say it is when it's really just notification. Same thing in doctor's offices, apps, everything. There's no consent. It's just you've been notified. And so I feel like the way that our institutions are, that we have unknowingly designed a world. I'll just talk about the US. We have gotten our students used to not expecting consent. And so going out into the world then where they don't have consent, they are used to it. And I think it's a real problem. And I think that that is part of why what is happening right now is with all the chaos and disruption is being allowed to happen.
Mm.
And I want to say that I'm really talking about, because I think institutions are all different, but I'm really talking about public institutions, although I think the lack of consent does run through all institutions.
I'm very aware at Oberlin today, this is consent month. I've had multiple conversations with students who are going to present a workshop on consent in dance. And there's a whole, month-long thing. A former student of mine's coming back with a film and introducing that. One of the things I think you're referring to about notification is, Robin, is this whole kind of liability. It's all about liability, and it's all about, kind of covering your ass. And I think that when I talk about consent and contact for my students, I talk about, for me, the idea that verbal consent is not coerced is a real problem. That, how often do you really have a chance to not give consent when you're about to walk in a doctor's office because you have to click the thing before you get to go in? So I think that one thing that contact can be very instrumental in is learning the kind of nuances of touch and nonverbal experiences of consent, and feeling that experience when you're dancing and being very much aware of it. Mayfield has been here, Mayfield Brooks, who wrote one of the blurbs on the back, has been here multiple times, and they have a whole way to think about, consent physically. Yes, I'm available. I want energetic exchange, or no, I don't want any kind of physical touch. And they can move in and out of that very quickly without a whole lot of conversation. Because I think one of the things that happens is that the conversation pulls us out of our bodies rather than bringing it back into our bodies.
And I'll just say, I think a lot of times when people say, teaching consent, they end up teaching people how to give consent rather than how to ask for consent.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm interested in is, how do we ask for this?
And I think what you're bringing, Michelle, in your essay as well is a differentiation of the kind of broader culture of consent in relationship with the individual being able to speak to consent. But I think that's what I'm attracted to in many of these essays in this section is the ways of kind of recognizing the larger environment situation influences on the dance as a whole, on our not just coming down to as you had said, the kind of individual has to take responsibility, which is certainly a part of this whole mix. And I think that's this kind of inner outer that contact improvisation kind of studies and tracks. And I see it a lot in these essays of being able to broadly look at the larger factors influencing, and then zoning into personal experience and how that is felt and expressed. And yeah, as how on a bigger scale we can be practicing these ways of not just, I mean, I can personally practice how to ask for consent, and we can practice how, as a whole, we're setting up the conditions in such a way that it's there, it's ready and available for us to, oh, I could ask this way or I could ask that way. It's in the mix. Not on each of us to have to learn all of these things individually, that we get to throw in together and learn together.
And I just want to add on Robin, in terms of you talking about everything that's coming in, like, we can try and create this microcosm of a jam, but there are all these outside influences. And I really appreciated, Robin, as a little girl, I took modern dance, and and I was just horrified reading your essay, and learning some of the incredibly racist underpinnings of dance leaders. It does help put it in perspective.
Great.
I just,
Go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, Michelle, I think a lot about reforming this first rule. You talk about the first rule of contact. And I had my own, because there are no official rules, I have my own set of, the tenets of contact improv for my students, because the place that I predominantly teach contact is in higher ed. And that's rule number one. And, rule number two, there are rules that, then like we're responsible for the space together and stuff like that. But I've been thinking a lot about rule one and reforming it. And I also recognize that environments are very different. And so for me, because my students come into class and they have already had lots of classes together and they know each other and they're familiar with each other, I have kept it as rule number one for that situation only, which is, people who know each other well and they're coming in. And I work at a place that would like to pretend to be a conservatory. And so like there's what rule number one does really well for particularly young females is it keeps them from doing the like, oh, are you going to be okay? Are you going to be okay if I give you my weight? Are you going to be okay? Because otherwise I have to spend so much time with that. And so I feel like that was what rule number one was designed to do. And so I think there's, a positive way in which I can still use it. However, I've been doing a lot of rethinking about what does it mean and how does it need to be reformed? And we've had a lot of class conversations about that as well. um, I forget where I was going with this, but part of it was a thank you for like bringing up those ideas and having us think about, okay, for me, rule number one was very positive in many ways. As a contact dancer and doing contact. I don't, I think that one thing that rule number one does that I think is very harmful, it's again this idea that it's the consent has already been given, like you put yourself in this space and the default is yes. And if you don't want that, it's your responsibility, right? And I have been in situations, even when I'm the person with the power in the room, where I have been part of something that I feel really uncomfortable with and haven't been able to get out of, right? So it's not always about like who has the most power in the room. I think there is something about this rule number one that creates a system, creates something in which it can be very difficult to get out of situations.
Well, certainly the difference between, a class where people are together in a university
All the
versus
time. Yeah,
jam situations where you don't know people who are coming in and it's open, and you want to keep that kind of
totally different.
ethos of open exchange. That has a very different kind of dynamic than I feel like when I teach contact, I have a very different sense of control with the students and the students with one another because we're learning in a class with that same group of people. And that's different from then when we have all of our Sunday jams are open and people will come in. So it's a different negotiation. I'm going to take this opportunity looking at time to open up questions if people who are out there, thank you for coming, people, want to put a question, either raise your hand and Annika can click on you or put it in the chat and we can read it. So if any of the participants out there have questions for us, now's the time to raise your hand.
So to respond to that, Robin, I guess I just would say I'm not saying it's not a good rule. I do think
Sure.
it's a good rule. I just don't think it's because if it's the default, then it does end up being that um, you can get blamed for not responding. It leads to, among other things, victim blaming. I wrote another essay, how the first rule brought me to contact improv, um,
Mm.
which goes
And that
into,
might be the one that I'm actually referring to. So I'm sorry if I'm getting your work mixed up. Go
oh
ahead.
no, well, I mean, that goes into more detail
Mhm.
about the issues with it than I did in this article. Um, so, um, but it's interesting to hear your take. I disagree, but as a
Well,
teacher, but yeah.
okay. I'm actually saying, like, I think it's good to question rule number
Yeah.
one, and it should not exist in well, not exist, but it should be ameliorated in most places. So I think that
Yeah.
I just want to be clear. I'm not supporting, I'm not saying it should be rule one. I'm saying I have found some instances in which it's helpful.
Uh-huh.
What I think I really want to say is, I am not a pushover. I'm always accused of being like pushing back too much, of being too defensive, of, advocating for myself too much. And yet I have found myself in instances in contact improv in which I didn't want to be in those and I did not get myself out of it. And so the question for me is, what is it, in the practice of contact that has why do I feel unable to get myself out of that in contact when in another situation I would totally get out of it? And I think part of that is rule one. So I think I'm agreeing with you and saying rule one is a problem.
I think
Yeah, well, I mean,
maybe
because I would say that the issue is how did you get into that situation to begin with? I mean, if we're talking about respect and listening to each other, then hopefully whoever got you into that situation would have realized that maybe Robin wasn't feeling it. I mean, so it's about prevention
Yeah, but
rather
I've also
than,
gotten
you
into
know.
that
so
situation.
we do have a question, which, maybe would be useful. This is from the chat. And it's jams can have such a feel-good goal context. I love this legacy of questioning. And Sarah, you mentioned Nancy teaching how to question. Is there anything you each would like to share about how you came to CI dancing, asking questions, and drawing others into questioning? I guess I was looking at Dina, because I think that your essay is interesting kind of historically, right? So you came into it in the 70s. I came into contact in the 80s, and feminism was very much like feminist theory was very much part of my schooling as I became more and more involved in contact. So the whole question of the ways in which gender, like you were saying, Sarah, like it's both intimate and a personal, but it's also structural as well. So that sense of understanding contact, not just in the immediate moment, but also as part of a kind of structural legacy of, sexism, racism, and all these layers in which you think things are going okay, but underneath these other histories or other power dynamics start to affect you or rise up. And yeah, and I think that that's maybe something that was how I started questioning contact at the same time, like falling in love with it, like feeling like this is a form that gives my body exactly what it wants. I could be fierce, I could be graceful. I was not somebody who danced as a young child, so dancing with someone else was a great way to free my own kind of self-consciousness, in moving, and that there was a kind of exchange that felt much more martial than dancey dancey, was really important in kind of opening up the field of dance for myself.
Mhm. I want to riff off of that. It's perfect because the questions I was asking, first of all, I started to be a dancer and moved into modern dance, and I'd already injured my back in theater, and I was already asking the question, could I be a dancer? Could I dance as my life's work if with this injury, because I could no longer do an arabesque or force my lower back. And contact appeared at that moment as my way of continuing in the dance world and moving, as I said in my essay, from a modern dance framework of a very rigorous kind of codified dance form to something much more open. And I literally, as did Anne, fall in love with the dance form. and realized immediately that this would be my dance world, and it was the door opening to my continuing to dance. So that was my question. Could I continue dancing this way? No, I couldn't. And what would give me that possibility to be a dancer? It was contact improvisation and postmodern dance, in which Yvonne Rainer, in her minimalist statement, said that, well, she began to declare that all movement could be considered as dance. That was part of her philosophy. And that just opened everything up in the dance world. All movement might be thought of as dance or could be considered dance. Those were my questions.
So we have another question. I'm taking questions from the audience here in the chat. This is, hi, I love this conversation. I love your perspectives. I'm inspired to relook at my classes and jams and how I'm containing and insisting on certain norms and understanding that I am the institutional hierarchical figure, at the same trying to flatten it and insisting that my students challenge me. This person says, I don't understand where the first rule came from and so solidly named. My teachers never really said it so strongly, but in context of how interactive dance was before the 60s and how it's different through CI. Can someone tell us where this first rule came from? Sarah, do you want to take that? Because I think that
I can.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to have you share your perspective, Michelle. I would just say from I'm more familiar with what can I say? From before the first rule. I guess I can't say where. I mean, I've heard some stories about where it came from, but I have much more of a clarity from my learnings that that there was not certainly something named a first rule. I think it's really interesting when we call something a rule, like who determines that and who enforces that. So I it's an interesting construct, just rule the first and then it's the first. Um, so I have always learned that certainly taking care of ourselves and taking care of others and how that includes the environment, the people, the space, the all the human skills, I guess Nancy would talk about. So I don't know if I can speak to the first rule where it began, but I can. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll speak to that. In my essay, how the first rule brought me to contact improv, I do quote some people using that terminology, Martin Keough and Richard Kim. But then it was also in Contact Quarterly. I can't necessarily remember exactly who it was that said that. And Nancy wrote a letter in Contact Quarterly talking about how she thought it might have come to be, as starting as kind of a game of telephone, where the notion of take care of yourself and others, that the and others got dropped. So yeah. So I mean, I would say that it's in I think it was Carolyn Stewart actually who talked about take care of yourself first. And I would say that even if it's not called the first rule, I see often that it essentially is there, and the priority of taking care of yourself is primary, as opposed to listening and respecting and taking care of.
okay. We're starting to get, like, it's exciting. We're starting to get people responding. So I think that we might not get to all of them, but one of the things that somebody wrote was, what advice do you have for how to engage leaderships on issues of feeling safe in a space? Um, so
Um, yeah, my essay talks about that, and I would say the most important thing is creating democratic governance, um, being clear about who's responsible, and having multiple people involved, and empowering people, which I think is something that, when you talked, Anne, about relevance for the question that I sort of batted away when you first started this because it was so hard, is I think we need to learn to be democratic, and I think we can learn how to do that in our contact community.
I mean, I think very specifically one way to do that, you mentioned, in jams that are weekly jams, there aren't necessarily a climate of coming at the beginning in situations where there's a little bit of a class at the beginning. Oftentimes, then a jam will start with a circle, an opening circle, and that's an opportunity to point out people that are used to the space, that can be contacted while you're dancing, that have that kind of shared leadership. That's one way I think that is helpful. So there's not just one person who is teaching or guiding everything. I mean, certainly at CI 50, I knew that we would, partly because we had a mask mandate, but I knew we would need a lot of support. So we had people in purple, dark purple t-shirts. So the people in dark purple t-shirts were the people that you could contact for whatever. If it was something that wasn't working in the jam for you, if it was, I need a Band-Aid, I need to figure out where something is, those are the people that you can kind of reach out to. So I think that oftentimes those opening circles can be helpful. The problem is that they can also, if it's 2-hour jam and you take 25 minutes for an opening circle, it ends up being a little cumbersome. So figuring that out in some ways. We have
that question, actually, I'm not quite sure when it's worded. It was saying engaging leadership on issues. I mean, is that also talking about if you don't feel safe in a space, how do you bring it up to leadership? And I guess I would say the
or
goal
how does
would be that the leader, that there would be a sense of that everyone's responsible for creating a safe space, and if you don't feel comfortable talking to the leaders, that you could, anyone in the jam is someone to talk about, to debrief and figure out how you want to move forward.
I think my sense from the question was that it's how do I, as someone who's facilitating something, kind of engage in a way that helps other people feel comfortable in the space. But I think, these are really great and important questions, and I don't think we have to solve them all here. But the fact that we are at a moment where we are engaging these questions, I think is really important and significant. And here is maybe one last, because guess what? Carolyn Stewart. So Carolyn Stewart is here. I don't actually see who the people are in the audience, but maybe somebody else can see. I don't know. I don't seem to be able to do that. But anyway, Carolyn Stewart says, hello. I appreciate the airplane directive to put on your own mask first and then attend to the whole. The first implies a second. It's a first only. If I don't have myself on board, how can I take care of anything else? It's not an either or, but both and. Michelle noted the airplane analogy assumed an emergency situation, appropriate because we are in an emergency. First self, second other, third the whole. Not a first only. Yeah, I was thinking about how, if we're trying to work one of the things I love about contact is we work horizontally, like we roll on the floor together. And I feel like that's, kind of, so how can we think about these rules as moving in a horizontal and not necessarily a vertically stacked way that kind of interact constantly with one another? Um, I am aware of time and I don't want to take people past the time. But anyway, so I want to thank everyone who was on the panel in this first roundtable Zoom. I want to encourage everybody else to get out and buy your book. Um, there are 30% discounts. You can always email me if you want one. And then very much thank my fellow contributors who like kept doing it, kept coming back and saying that they were going to contribute. I will just finish by saying that I had this vision for this book. And then after we did the writing workshop about 4 months later, when nobody had sent me anything really, I was like, what did I get myself into here? But fortunately, everybody did kind of come back. And so anyway, thank you very much for helping put this out. I'm very aware of the fact that Contact Quarterly is not publishing regularly, so I really encourage everyone to engage in these conversations and to really find ways to get that material out to people so we can keep growing a literacy around contact improvisation in this particular moment in time. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Annika, for facilitating this Zoom roundtable. And I will certainly have links when we start putting them up, but we won't do that till May because I'll get through all of the three. Next week, we're doing responsive touch. And the following week after that, we're doing local communities, global contexts. Yes, that's a hand.
We said we were going to stay on till 1:30. I don't know if you want to stay on longer or
Oh, okay. I thought it was an hour. Why did I think that was
I'm game
um
for whatever. I'm just looking at the flyer, not to...
I
oh,
also thought it was till 1:30.
okay, got it. Sorry. Um,
It'd be
all
like
right. Annika's like, you said it was until 1:30. Okay, but whatever works. Okay, sorry.
Well, if we get to keep going a little bit, then I'd be happy to say, I mean, there's so many things to say, and I appreciate this dialogue really. Um, but just like the ways that going back to this question of leadership and creating a contributing to a safer space and a jam, and just all the many ways that I think as leaders we can be clear in our own values and intentions and understanding how are we setting up a kind of catalyzing, equity promoting, space opening, whatever it is, the kind of space that we want to be cultivating. And I think that can, for me in my experience, it's been very helpful. I think, Michelle, you do speak to this about clarifying expectations before we walk up into the door, and that can be with our own selves as well. And again, as we keep talking about self, other, but just the ways in which people can have a sense of the space that they're coming into in the way that it was announced, in the way the space is set up, and all of these things. So I think that already sets up, that ground to be lying on when we come into the dance floor. And that also this thing about, I always thought it was very challenging. I mean, I continue to think it's challenging when someone comes with a concern or how do we honor that how do we honor the personal experience of someone while also bringing transparency to the space so that me as a leader, I don't have to hold and expect that I know what to do in all of these situations. So just going back to this whatever it is, sharing the leadership or sharing the ways in which we're all cultivating the space that we want to have. And I do think that's something about like how do we create an environment in which we can bring up the uncomfortable. We can bring up when something happens, and it doesn't, and it can even disrupt, and it can, things can even fall apart, but that doesn't have to be the end of the story, the end of the dance. So yeah, all of that.
Yeah.
And I just want to say, Sarah and I were talking a little bit in preparation for this, or emailing, just about what are the overlaps between how I've described Safer Brave Space and the underscore. And I think that there are an underscore can indeed be a safer, brave space, and that there are a lot of things that are part of it, like setting expectations, that is so important in creating safer, brave space, and having the opening and closing circles that help create a container about it. Just to address the airplane analogy briefly, the other issue with it, besides the fact that you're dealing with an emergency situation, which is a situation where, yes, you need to take care of yourself before you can take care of anyone else, is also that it's in the context of an airplane, which has already established rules and safety guidelines. So it's not, it's taking that rule a little out of context, in a very different context.
I want to circle back to what Sarah just said, because when I was thinking about that question that I threw out and that nobody wants to answer about, how contact can help us prepare for the world today, one of the things I do think is that contact at its best does make you feel comfortable with being challenged, and it does make you feel comfortable with being resisted. Like, I feel as if contact helps us understand how to exist in spaces that are disorienting, and not just physically disorienting, but also psychically disorienting. And that there's something about staying with that awkward moment, or that moment where you don't really know what's happening, and just being patient with it, that I feel as if has helped me in many different ways. And I mean, I think that's this contact. I think it's also improvisation, frankly, but helped me to navigate very challenging experiences in my life. And I feel as if there's also something about, kind of, there's something that I could experience that I don't see right in front of my eyes, that could keep me in that moment where I'm suspended, and my imagination can allow me to think past an immediate response or a habitual response. And that's where I feel we are right now. Like, none of the responses that we're used to giving is going to work right now. So we need to really bring our imaginations to, like, how do we survive outside of this dynamic? So
So I just want to say, Anne, I do want to answer your question. And I think that the idea that contact prepares us for active consent was one thought of how contact prepares us. But I also wanted to bring up this idea of disruption, and which you just brought up. This idea that, like, what is contact's relationship, CI's relationship to disruption? And also, what is the relationship between consent and co-creation and disruption? And because I'm not sure that they can really exist in the same spaces. And I wrote a little bit about that
Yeah.
at the end of my paper. And I just want to read it really quickly, because this is what stood out to me in critical mass. So, two prevalent strategies for orienting CI towards justice, equity, and inclusion emerged: operating with active consent and disrupting normative language and practice. What emerged at CI at 50 for me was the incompatibility of consent and disruption. Disruption by design cannot ask for or require consent. And while it only takes one person to disrupt, it takes an entire group to consent. Moreover, in American context, I'm going to skip that about American context, but yeah, I'll just say that this idea, if some people are working hard to work towards active consent and co-creation, and other people are working towards disruption, um, disruption in some ways is the opposite of consent. It's saying, I'm going to come in, I'm going to disrupt this because I have a more important thing to talk about. And I think that's a little bit, we can see that right now. Things are being disrupted. None of us are giving consent to it, right? It's just happening. And so that both of these techniques can work towards justice and equity and so forth. And yet I'm not really sure they can operate in the same space. So I'm just throwing it out there.
I love that. Yeah, I really appreciate it. And I just want to say that what first came to mind for me are these kind of like concentric circles or something like that. Like, can we consent to some level of disruption? And then can that level of consent be disrupted? Like how do we keep like maybe there's scales or facets of disruption and consent in a shared space or over time or with different people so that we can actually keep gosh, I almost have an image of it. What is it? But yeah, just this way of they don't not necessarily a binary one on one side, one on the other, but that there's all of these different like I just see like this effervescence, like bubbles of um, consent and disruption in different climate at different scales. And when the scale is kind of tenable or that we can take it on, then we can keep advancing our ability to be resilient to disruption and expansive in our ability to consent to and ask for consent, something like that.
So I missed in the chat somebody's question. So I'm going to go back to it because they were like, yo, lady, talk. So anyway, so this is from someone who said, beyond no thank you, I don't want that right now. Do you have any suggestions of how to express resistance in dances, especially non-verbally, since that often seems to take us into a place of mental projections? Um,
Just really quickly, I want to say, Anne, I think that you talked about this with Mayfield Brooks and the energy and the no thanks. Um, I think that's one way.
yeah, I mean, I think that's one way. I think the other way is, like to get when I experienced that, to come back to my like, punk rock kind of origins and just like get, fierce, like physically get fierce, kind of in a way that expresses non-verbally a sense of like no, or if I mean, because I'm a teacher, so I dance with students a lot. So if students are using their hands a lot, you know how students can use hands when they're trying, I'll just hold on to one of their hands one time and just like that will be the beginning of that dance. And it tends to give people a sense of other possibilities. So other suggestions? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I've always been a passive resistor. I'm someone who laid down on the ground at protests, that kind of thing. So I've done it myself, and I've also given permission to my students and at jams to simply quietly walk away from a dance. I have done that and still do. Really, just draw away and just walk away from the dance as a form of passive resistance. I don't know if that helps, but that's what I do. Mm.
I also think part of it is and why we talk about this so much is just like bringing the ideas into our head so that when we walk into this space, we have a plan how to get out, or we are aware of it at least. And I think I know it's not enough to say, we all need to be aware of this stuff, but I think that the more aware we are and the more aware everyone is, you know, uh, um, practicing saying no, I think through exercises. I do that sometimes with students, especially for, groups of people who aren't used to saying no, don't feel like they can say no. Practicing ways of saying no, um, both verbally and physically. I usually, I do that in class. So I feel like there may not, maybe we don't have the amount of concrete stuff yet. The sort of symbols that Mayfield Brooks is saying, this is what this means, this is what this means, walk away from a dance. But some of it is like really like knowing, because I was taught in an environment of contact in which none of that was ever a problem. It's just not a problem. It's your own problem, right? And so this idea of like getting out of a situation was really hard. Whereas now that I know, I look back and I think, okay, this is what I should have done. This is what I should have done. And having students, this is like bystander theory, right? You'd like have students practice. How are they going to say no? Are they going to do it this way? Are they going to do it this way? And this is more of a training situation than a jam situation, obviously. But the idea of knowing ahead what you're going to do, or you see something, what are you going to do?
I
Can,
have,
can I just can I just intervene quickly? Ross wrote this question, Ross Phillip, and really this format is a little difficult to get more interactive. Can we see Ross? Can he actually talk to us? Because I would like to know what he does. I'd like to throw the question back to him if we can
And
through this.
also anybody who wants to speak, I think, to us.
Yes,
uh,
but can we try with Ross because he's posed the question? Is there some way to hear him or see him or not? Or can he
there you
answer?
go. There he
Okay.
is.
All
And
right.
Hi. Thank you so much, all of you, for your ideas. I really appreciate your speaking to it. I'm a host of a jam in Colorado, and we often begin our jams with some exercises around consent and around um, how to say no to certain dances. But I feel that um, I would like to have more skill in offering other ideas, other ways. And so I heard like that idea of being a bit like abrupt in your movement, a bit forceful, kind of the punk rocky idea, or attaching to the limb that you feel is maybe if someone's getting too handsy, or simply walking away, or interestingly going passive. That's a interesting one. But I think that there are a lot of exercises centered around sort of verbally speaking, um, which is effective, but it doesn't really allow for a lot of nuance in the conversation when that you're this conversation that you might want to continue with someone. You might not want to actually leave this dance, but you would like the quality of touch or something about the nature of the dance to change or to shift. And how do you express that? And that's kind of what my question that's where my question was motivated from.
Can I just say, Ross, I think your question is the question in contact right now. I really do. And I think that's one of the reasons we don't have necessarily concrete answers is because I think this is something the field is trying to work out and work through.
I
we
guess
have,
I would say, I mean, again, that's basically looking at, how to say no. And I'm interested in trying to find exercises and so forth that develop people's listening skills. So this concern about how to say no to people isn't as urgent.
yeah, we have one more question that we haven't answered yet, and this is probably for Sarah. I know last time we were like, oh no,
Okay.
but it's I have a curiosity of how did Nancy Stark Smith bring up consent in her spaces?
Yeah, I noticed that question. I was thinking about it, and I do think this is the topic, and it's changed and shifted. So much has shifted. I think in with the Me Too movements and just the societal shifts. And what I can say is, I keep zooming out. I really think Nancy would cultivate in the conditions, the environment in such a way to kind of set certain standards. So I don't I think it showed up in many different places all over the place. She would talk about being aware, available, responsive, and clear. I think you can like unpack these words to find bringing kind of um, this negotiation that we keep going back to of self and other, and how do we relate, and how do we communicate, and how do we listen. I think it comes up in tone, like what tone are we using in the dance, and what are we reading, how are we reading it, what is it conveying, and just practicing how we're in tone. I think it has to do with the clarity of our expectation. Like, are we working with forces, are we working with our relationship to gravity? And if so, it doesn't negate all the social and all the emotional, all of it. But like, what are we both doing right now? Is this hand on the hip in relation to finding the fulcrum point? You know, you can't read into all of these things, so I'm not saying this is like the end all answer, but I do think something about like where we put our attention is, you know, can also inform like what we're going towards, and then yeah, and then the many ways that we can feel like we have a voice and agency, and how, whether it's a literal voice or you know, the movement.
So
Sarah,
Sarah,
he wants you to repeat those four words again.
Oh, sure, yeah, yeah, this is a funny format. Aware, available, responsive, and clear. And certainly I'm mushing all my own perspective with what I gained from Nancy, but I'm certainly trying to make sense of it, from this explicit
maybe
con
just type them into the chat
concept.
quickly.
Go
Just
for
type
it.
them in the chat quickly.
I think one of the things I remember learning from Nancy is that you don't want any kind of, I mean, you know, that sense of releasing expectations, right? You know, but you don't want any kind of goal or desire to overpower your ability to respond physically. So when you start to think to yourself, I want to do a lift here,
Yeah.
you know, she would be like, see if you can suspend that habit so that you're still really in the dance as opposed to kind of moving habitually into a lift or you know something. And I think that that is that kind of acknowledgement. And I think it is a part of listening to another person to constantly be aware of your own desire and kind of finding ways to acknowledge it, but not necessarily act on that. And it could be, you know, a desire, kind of sexual desire. It could be a desire to lift. It could be a desire for a certain kind of dance because you're used to dancing with this person in a certain way. And how do you learn to get beyond that expectation or that desire to open up other possibilities? And it's also a way to open up other possibilities in your own dancing, to not move into that, to kind of, you know, keep that curiosity alive so that each dance can be fresh, even if it's somebody you've danced with for, you know, decades on end.
And I just want to bring up somebody else's question that I know I'm still thinking about, even though I haven't attempted an answer yet, about asking questions and drawing others into questioning that came earlier, about how we came into CI dancing and asking questions and drawing others into questioning. Um, that's it just it's so connected to this idea of listening, and how do you how do you get others to listen if they don't want to listen? I don't really I have so many questions about that. I have no freaking idea. Um,
Here's Carolyn Stewart again. You know, people, I'm not like Annika and I are trying to do this as well as possible. We're not experts at it, so we will try to figure out for next time how to bring people in if they have a specific question. But Carolyn Stewart says, instead of trying to figure out the next system to fit ourselves into, I'm interested in an infinite unfolding emergent process of inquiry, discovering, reporting on, trusting the co-creative improvisation to lead and inform us on a horizontal playing field, which was the origins of CI, to let what's up in the room to quite and care for the room. CI calls for a paradigm shift from vertical to horizontal to hone ability to care for all rather than perpetuate the either or, right, wrong, good, bad, win, lose. So that's their comment. And okay, so I'm sorry, people, that I was like, oh, I think because I was on this podcast that was like a cool hour yesterday, I assumed that today was an hour, but I'm glad that we stayed on for an hour and a half. But I am aware that it's time to close. So I'll repeat myself and say thank you, participants, very much for contributing to this book and for being back to continue the conversation. And hopefully these are conversations that will continue. And who knew that people would show up? But thank you, people, for showing up, because they did. And yeah, so thanks, Annika, also for making this happen. And yeah, I love you all. Have a great day and go to your hands-off protests. Bye. Oh.